At Jefferson High, the hallways had their own rhythm, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on polished floors, the low hum of gossip and laughter bouncing off cinderblock walls. But beneath that everyday noise ran a quieter current, one most students learned to read early. Who to avoid, who held power, and who was fair game. It wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone knew. And if you were new, quiet, or just different in the wrong way, you could find yourself on the wrong side of that invisible line before you even realized you'd crossed it. That's exactly where the new kid landed. He'd shown up 3 weeks into the fall semester with a backpack that looked like it had seen better days and a pair of worn-out shoes that barely squeaked when he walked. He didn't strut or slouch, just moved with a kind of steady calm that made him stand out in a place where most kids either tried too hard or not at all. He kept his eyes forward, answered questions in class with a voice that was clear but never loud, and never lingered in groups during lunch. He ate alone not because he seemed lonely, but because he seemed focused, like he had somewhere else to be even when he was right there. The group that ruled the school's social food chain didn't like that. They liked reactions. They liked fear. They liked the way some kids stammered or flinched when they passed by. But this new kid? He didn't do any of that. He didn't glare, didn't smirk, didn't even seem to notice them most days. And that silence, it started to get under their skin. The leader of the group was a senior named Trey, broad-shouldered, loud, and used to getting his way. His two closest friends, Rico and Dev, followed his lead like shadows. They'd been running the same playbook for years. A shove here, a mocking nickname there, a well-timed prank that always stopped just short of getting them expelled. Teachers turned a blind eye because nothing ever left a mark you could photograph. But the students, they felt it. And they stayed out of the trio's way. So when Trey accidentally bumped into the new kid near the lockers one Tuesday morning, hard enough to knock his books to the floor, it wasn't really an accident. It was a test. Oops, Trey said, smirking as he stepped over the scattered papers without offering a hand. Watch where you're going, man. Most kids would have mumbled an apology, scrambled to pick up their things, and hurried off. But the new kid didn't move right away. He just stood there for a beat, calm as ever, then knelt slowly and started gathering his stuff. When he stood back up, he met Trey's eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with something unreadable. Something steady. Trey frowned. You got a problem? No, the new kid said simply. Just picking up my books. Then he walked off, not fast, not slow. Like nothing had happened. That look stayed with Trey longer than he expected. Not because it scared him, nothing scared him, but because it confused him. He was used to control, used to seeing the effect he had on people. But this? This was like throwing a punch into fog. You didn't even know if it landed. Over the next few days, the group tried again. A snide comment in the cafeteria line, a fake cough that sounded suspiciously like a racial slur, mumbled just loud enough to sting but soft enough to deny if challenged. They even spread a rumor that the new kid had been kicked out of his last school for starting a fight. But none of it seemed to rattle him. He kept showing up, kept doing his work, kept walking with that same quiet stride. What they didn't know was that every night after school, the new kid went home to a small house on the edge of town where his grandfather waited. The old man had raised him since he was 6 after his parents were gone. He'd been a Marine, the kind of man who believed discipline wasn't about punishment, it was about preparation. Every morning before school, they'd go through a short routine, 10 minutes of stretching, 5 minutes of breathing, and one simple rule. Don't let anyone make you small, his grandfather would say. Not with their hands, not with their words. You carry yourself like you matter because you do. So when the shoves and whispers came, the new kid didn't shrink. He remembered those mornings. He remembered the weight of his grandfather's hand on his shoulder, the steadiness in his voice. And he knew that reacting in anger wouldn't prove anything, except that they'd gotten to him. But that didn't mean he was helpless. He started paying closer attention. He noted who laughed when Trey made a joke at his expense. He saw which teachers looked away. He even pulled out his phone one afternoon when Rico tripped and spilled his soda on the new kid's shirt, capturing just enough of the smirk on Rico's face to know it wasn't an accident.
He didn't post it online?
Didn't show it to anyone yet. He just saved it. Because he'd learned early that proof mattered more than pride. Still, the pressure built. Kids whispered as he passed. Some looked at him with pity, others with suspicion. A few even avoided sitting near him, afraid they'd become targets too. It was lonely, sure, but loneliness wasn't the same as weakness. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about what kind of place Jefferson High was going to be. Was it going to be a school where bullies ran things? Or somewhere people could actually feel safe? The final straw came during gym class. They were playing basketball and Trey accidentally elbowed him hard in the ribs while going for a rebound. The wind rushed out of him and he stumbled back, clutching his side. The gym teacher barely glanced over. "Keep it clean, guys," he called half-heartedly before turning back to his clipboard. But this time, something shifted. The new kid straightened up slowly. He didn't yell, didn't shove back. He just looked at Trey, really looked at him, and said, quiet but clear, "You really picked the wrong guy." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, like he was telling Trey something he should have known all along. Trey laughed it off, but his friends noticed the way his eyes narrowed. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure what came next. And in a world where control was everything, uncertainty was dangerous. That night, the new kid sat at his kitchen table with his grandfather. He didn't cry, didn't rage. He just laid out everything that had happened, the shoves, the rumors, the elbow in gym class. His grandfather listened without interrupting. When he was done, the old man nodded once. "All right," he said. "Then it's time to stop letting them write the story." And with that, the new kid knew what he had to do. Not with fists, not with insults, but with truth, with evidence, and with the kind of quiet courage that doesn't need an audience to be real. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to be broken, and then decide to stand up anyway. The days after gym class felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened. The new kid, Darius, didn't say much at school, but inside something had clicked into place. He wasn't angry exactly, more like decided, like he'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to fix things and realized he had to be the one to act. At home, his grandfather didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, he pulled out an old notebook from the kitchen drawer, thick paper, spiral-bound, the kind they used to use for grocery lists and repair notes. "Start writing," he said. "Every time something happens. Who was there, what they said, what you saw." So Darius did. He wrote about the shove by the lockers, the soda spill, the elbow in gym. He noted the dates, the times, even the weather, little details that made it real. He saved screenshots of the group chat where someone had posted a blurry photo of him with a caption that read, "New punching bag." He didn't respond, didn't argue. He just collected it all like pieces of a puzzle only he could see. But writing wasn't enough. His grandfather knew that too. "You can't just defend yourself with paper," he said one morning before sunrise. "You've got to be ready in your body too, not to fight but to hold your ground." So they started again. Not the full drills from when Darius was younger, but the basics: stance, balance, breathing. His grandfather moved slower now. His knees didn't bend like they used to, but his hands were still steady, his voice firm. "If someone comes at you, you don't swing first," he'd say. "But you don't flinch either. You stand. You look them in the eye, and you make it clear you're not prey." Darius practiced in the backyard after school, shadowboxing under the fading light, not to hurt anyone, but to feel strong in his own skin again. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about remembering who he already was. Back at school, the trio noticed the change. Trey tried the same old tricks, blocking Darius in the hallway, muttering under his breath during class, but Darius didn't look down anymore. He walked with his shoulders back, his steps sure. When Rico joked about his clothes in the cafeteria, Darius just paused, looked him in the eye, and said, "You must be real bored if that's the best you got." Then he kept eating. The comment wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. But it landed, because it wasn't fear, it was calm. And calm was harder to break than anger. That unnerved them more than any punch could. Rumors started shifting. Some kids whispered that Darius had connections or that he'd been in juvie, wild guesses born from confusion. But others, the quiet ones who'd stayed silent out of fear, began watching him differently. Like maybe, just maybe, someone could push back without becoming what they were fighting against. One afternoon, a girl from his biology class slipped a note into his locker. It just said, "I saw what they did in the stairwell last week. I'll back you up if you say something." No name. No signature, but it was enough to remind him he wasn't as alone as it felt. Still, the school did nothing. The teachers acted like the tension was just teen drama. The principal's office sent a generic email about respect and kindness after a student reported a different incident, but nothing changed in the hallways. Darius knew if he wanted action, he'd have to make it happen himself. He asked his grandfather about it over dinner. Spaghetti with jarred sauce. The kind they always had on Thursdays. "What if I go to the office with all this?" he asked, tapping the notebook. His grandfather stirred his tea slowly. "They might not listen the first time, might not even the second, but if you show up with proof, with witnesses, with calm, not rage, they'll have to look. And once they look, they can't pretend it's not there." So Darius waited for the right moment. It came during a fire drill. Everyone stood outside in the cold, huddled in groups, breath fogging in the air. Trey and his friends were laughing loudly near the bike racks, reenacting some cruel joke. Darius stood a few yards away, arms crossed, watching. Then Trey spotted him and smirked. "What, you scared to come closer?" he called out. A few kids turned to look. Darius didn't move right away. Then he walked over, not fast, not slow, until he was just outside arm's reach. "I'm not scared of you," he said, voice low but clear. "I'm just tired of pretending you matter." The laughter died. Trey's face flushed. "You think you're tough now, huh?" "No," Darius said. "I just know the difference between noise and strength." Someone in the crowd let out a quiet damn. It wasn't support exactly, but it wasn't silence either. Later that day, Darius went to the front office. He didn't storm in, didn't raise his voice. He asked to speak with the assistant principal, and when she finally had time, he laid it all out. The notebook, the screenshots, the names of 2 students who'd seen things happen. He didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. He just told the truth, plain and steady. The assistant principal listened, nodded, took notes. Said they'd look into it. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. That night, Darius didn't sleep right away. He sat on his bedroom floor, staring at the notebook on his desk. He thought about all the times he'd wanted to yell, to shove back, to disappear. But he hadn't. And now, for the first time, there was a chance things might actually change. His grandfather knocked softly on the door and came in without waiting for an answer. He didn't say much, just sat on the edge of the bed and handed Darius a mug of warm milk with a spoonful of honey, the way he had since he was a kid. "You did good today," he said. Darius nodded. "Feels like it's just beginning." "Yeah," his grandfather said. "But beginnings are the hardest part. Once you've stepped forward, the rest finds its way." Outside, the streetlights hummed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Normal sounds. Quiet sounds. But for the first time in weeks, they felt peaceful instead of tense. Because Darius wasn't waiting anymore. He was moving, and that made all the difference. The next morning, he walked into school with the same backpack, the same worn shoes, but something had shifted. Not in the building, not in the bullies, but in him. He wasn't the target anymore. He was the one setting the pace, and deep down he knew. This wasn't about taking them down. It was about standing up and showing others they could too. The week after Darius walked into the assistant principal's office, nothing seemed to change, at least not on the surface. The same bell rang, the same lockers slammed, the same groups gathered in the same corners of the cafeteria. But underneath, something had shifted. It was subtle, like the first crack in ice before it breaks. People watched him differently now, not with pity or fear, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, like they were waiting to see what came next. Trey and his friends acted like nothing had happened. They laughed louder in the halls, shoved each other playfully, tossed their backpacks around like they owned the place. But Darius noticed the glances they shot his way when they thought he wasn't looking. Quick, nervous flicks of the eyes. They were used to control, to knowing exactly how people would react. But Darius didn't fit the script anymore, and that uncertainty made them jittery. Then came gym class again. It was basketball day. Teams were picked the usual way. Captains choosing, the last few kids always left standing awkwardly until someone took pity. Darius didn't mind. He'd rather play alone than pretend to be part of a group that didn't want him. But today Trey was captain, and when it was his turn to pick, he pointed right at Darius. "Him," Trey said, smirking. "Let's see what he's got." Darius didn't flinch. He walked onto the court like it was just another day. The game started rough, elbows out, voices sharp. Every time Darius got near the ball, Someone accidentally clipped him. A knee to the thigh. A hand in his back. Nothing the teacher would call a foul, but enough to wear a person down. Then it happened. Midway through the second half, Darius drove toward the basket. Trey came at him fast, shoulder first, not to block, but to knock him off balance. The impact sent Darius stumbling sideways. He caught himself, but not before his lip split open on the edge of his own teeth. Blood welled up, warm and metallic. He tasted it instantly. The gym teacher barely looked up from his clipboard. For a second, Darius just stood there, breathing through the sting. His hands curled, then uncurled. Old instincts flared, the kind that said, hit back, make them regret it. But he pushed them down. He remembered his grandfather's voice. Strength isn't shown in how hard you hit. It's in how well you hold yourself when everything's pushing you down. So instead of swinging, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looked at the red smear, and walked calmly to the sideline. He grabbed a paper towel from the supply cart, pressed it to his lip, and turned to face the court. Trey was watching him, chest puffed out, waiting for a reaction. But Darius didn't give him one. Not anger, not tears, just quiet. Then loud enough for the whole gym to hear, but not shouting, he said, "You really picked the wrong guy." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And this time it landed like a stone in still water. Kids stopped dribbling. Conversations died. Even the teacher looked up. Trey laughed, but it sounded forced. "Whatever, man. You're bleeding like a baby." Darius just nodded slowly. "Yeah, and you just assaulted me in front of 20 witnesses." That word, assaulted, hung in the air. It wasn't something kids said lightly. It made it real. Made it serious. The teacher finally stepped in. "All right, that's enough. Darius, go to the nurse. Trey, sit out the rest of the period." But Darius didn't move right away. He looked at Trey one last time. "This ends now." Then he walked out, head high, blood still on his chin. By lunchtime, the whole school had heard about it. Some said Darius had cursed him out. Others claimed he'd nearly thrown a punch. But the truth was simpler and stronger. He'd stayed calm. He'd named what happened. And he'd made it clear he wasn't playing their game anymore. That afternoon, Darius didn't go home right after school. Instead, he went back to the front office. This time, he asked for the principal. He brought the nurse's report signed, dated, noting laceration consistent with blunt force trauma. He brought his notebook, now filled with more entries. He even had 2 students willing to sign statements saying they saw Trey shove him without provocation. The principal, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense bun, listened longer this time. She flipped through the pages, asked careful questions, and didn't interrupt once. When Darius finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is serious," she said quietly, "but school discipline has limits, unless there's a pattern or outside involvement." Darius nodded. He'd expected that, so he'd come prepared. "I already contacted the Youth Advocacy Project," he said. "They help students with bullying cases when schools don't act. They said they'll review my file and might send someone to talk to you." The principal's expression changed, just slightly. Not fear, but caution, because now it wasn't just a student complaint. It was becoming a matter of record. "All right," she said finally. "We'll open a formal investigation. All 3 students will be interviewed. You'll be kept updated. It wasn't justice yet, but it was movement." That night, Darius sat at the kitchen table again, this time with his grandfather and a woman from the advocacy group on speakerphone. She asked gentle questions, took notes, explained the next steps. She didn't promise miracles, but she promised support. After the call, his grandfather poured them both glasses of lemonade, homemade with too much sugar, just how Darius liked it as a kid. "You're doing it right," his grandfather said. "Not with fists, with truth." Darius nodded, but his hands were shaking a little, not from fear, from the weight of it all. He'd spent weeks holding everything in, and now it was finally spilling out into the open. It felt terrifying and freeing. The next morning, things were different. Trey didn't look at him in the hallway. Rico avoided the cafeteria line when Darius was there. Dev sat alone at lunch, scrolling on his phone like he was trying to disappear. But more importantly, other kids started talking. Not just whispering, actually speaking up. A freshman thanked Darius for not letting them get away with it. A teacher pulled him aside to say she'd noticed what was going on, and was glad he spoke up. Even the school counselor asked if he wanted to join a new peer support group they were starting. Darius didn't say yes right away, but he didn't say no either, because he was starting to realize something. This wasn't just about stopping 3 bullies. It was about changing the air in the school, making it harder for cruelty to hide in plain sight. And for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting alone. The school buzzed in a way it hadn't before, not with gossip, but with something quieter, heavier. Like everyone could feel the ground shifting under their feet. The formal investigation was underway, and though the details weren't public, the tension was. Trey and his friends walked the halls like they were bracing for a storm. They didn't joke as loudly, didn't shove anyone. They kept their heads down, which would have been funny if it weren't so strange to see. Darius, meanwhile, kept moving like nothing had changed. Same backpack, same quiet steps, same seat in the back of English class. But inside he felt different, lighter somehow. Not because he'd won, nothing was settled yet, but because he'd stopped carrying the weight alone. He'd spoken up, shown proof, and now the system, slow as it was, had to respond. A few days after the gym incident, one of the 3 Dev approached him near the bike racks after school. He looked nervous, eyes darting like he expected someone to jump out and call him a traitor. "Hey," he mumbled, shoving his hands in his pockets. I didn't sign up for all this. I was just going along, you know. I didn't mean for it to get this far." Darius didn't say anything right away. He remembered the times Dev had laughed the loudest, the way he'd egged Trey on when things got rough. But he also remembered how Dev had hesitated once, just for a second, before joining in on a cruel joke in the hallway. Maybe that hesitation meant something. "I believe you didn't plan for it to go this far," Darius said finally, "but you still chose to be part of it." "That matters," Dev nodded, looking at his shoes. "Yeah, I get that." He paused. "I told the investigator everything. About the locker shove, the soda thing. All of it." Darius studied him. There was no pride in Dev's voice, just regret. And maybe a little relief. "Good," Darius said. "Now do better." Dev gave a small nod and walked off, shoulders slumped but head a little higher than before. Not long after, Rico tried a different tactic. He showed up in the library during study hall and slid into the chair across from Darius. He didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned in and said, "You know they're gonna twist this, right? Say you started it. Say you're lying." Darius didn't look up from his notebook. "Let them try." "You think the school's really gonna side with you?" Rico pressed, voice low. "I don't need them to side with me," Darius said calmly. "I just need them to see the truth." Rico stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head and walked away. But this time there was no smirk. Just confusion, like he couldn't figure out why Darius wasn't playing by the old rules. Trey, though, doubled down. He started spreading new rumors, that Darius had faked the injury, that he'd threatened them, that he was trying to get them expelled so he could take over. But this time, fewer people believed it. Too many had seen what really happened. Too many had their own stories they'd kept quiet for too long. Then came the school assembly. It was supposed to be about digital citizenship, online safety, cyberbullying, that kind of thing. But at the last minute, the principal added a surprise guest, Darius. No one knew he'd agreed to speak until he walked up to the mic, notebook in hand, heart pounding but face calm. He didn't stand behind the podium. Just stood in the center of the stage like he was talking to friends. "I didn't come here to tell you how I got pushed around," he began, voice steady. "I came to tell you what I learned from it." He talked about how silence protects bullies more than anything, how fear makes cruelty grow, how real strength isn't about throwing punches, it's about showing up even when you're scared. He didn't name names, didn't point fingers. He just told his story, plain and honest, like he was talking to his grandfather over dinner. "I used to think if I just kept my head down it would stop," he said. "But it doesn't stop. It just finds someone else. So I decided to stand up, not to fight them, but to show that we don't have to accept this as normal." When he finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole auditorium was applauding, not wildly but sincerely. Teachers included. Afterward, kids came up to him one by one. Some just nodded. Others said thank you. A few even admitted they'd been bullied too, but were too scared to say anything. For the first time, Darius didn't feel like the odd one out. He felt like part of something bigger. The next day, the school announced its findings. Rico and Dev were suspended for 10 days. partly for their role in the physical incidents, partly for the online harassment uncovered during the investigation. Their parents were called in. Mandatory counseling was required before they could return. Trey faced something worse: expulsion, not just because of the gym incident, but because the investigation uncovered a pattern: threats to other students, stolen property, even a past incident the school had quietly swept under the rug. With Darius's evidence and witness statements, they couldn't ignore it anymore. When Trey heard the news, he didn't yell, didn't cry. He just stood in the principal's office, pale and quiet, like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. For the first time, he looked small. Darius didn't gloat, didn't smile. He just felt sad, because it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And seeing Trey realize too late that actions have consequences, that wasn't victory. It was a warning. That evening, Darius sat on the porch with his grandfather as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Crickets started their evening song. A neighbor walked their dog down the street. Normal life returning. "You changed things," his grandfather said softly. "Not me," Darius replied. "All of us. The ones who finally spoke up." His grandfather smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. "You gave them the courage to." Darius looked out at the quiet street and thought about the assembly, the notes in his locker, the kids who'd thanked him. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He just wanted to walk through the halls without looking over his shoulder. But sometimes, doing the right thing even quietly ripples farther than you expect, and in that moment, sitting beside the man who taught him what real strength looked like, Darius knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something better. Spring came to Jefferson High like a slow exhale. The air warmed, the trees filled out, and the hallways, once thick with tension, felt lighter, like the school itself had learned to breathe again. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But something had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't show up in announcements or policy changes, but in the way kids looked at each other, in the small choices they made when no one was watching. Darius still walked the same path every morning, backpack slung over one shoulder, shoes scuffed but clean. But now, more often than not, someone would nod as he passed. Sometimes it was a quiet hey from a freshman who'd once hidden in the bathroom to avoid a hallway confrontation. Other times it was a teacher who'd stayed silent before but now made a point to ask how he was doing. These weren't grand gestures. They were just human ones, and they mattered. The biggest change came from the school itself. After the investigation, the principal didn't just hand down punishments and call it a day. She worked with the district to launch a new peer mediation program, one where students trained to help resolve conflicts before they turned ugly. And when they asked Darius to be one of the first student facilitators, he didn't say yes right away. He thought about it for a whole weekend, walking the same questions over and over in his head. Am I the right person? Will it even help? His grandfather answered without being asked. Over Sunday pancakes, he said, "You don't have to fix everything. You just have to show up." So Darius said yes. The training was harder than he expected. It wasn't about giving advice or taking sides. It was about listening, really listening, even when the words were messy or angry. He learned how to ask questions that opened doors instead of slamming them shut. How to sit with someone's pain without trying to fix it right away. How to hold space for truth even when it was uncomfortable. At first, kids were skeptical. "You're the guy who got Trey expelled," one sophomore said during an early session. "Why should I trust you?" Darius didn't get defensive. He just said, "Because I know what it's like to feel like no one's listening. And I don't want anyone else to feel that way." That honesty opened something. Slowly, students started coming, not just with big fights, but with small hurts. A rumor that wouldn't die, a friendship gone cold, the ache of being left out. Darius didn't solve their problems. He just helped them find their own words, their own way forward. Meanwhile, Rico and Dev returned after their suspension. They kept to themselves, heads down, voices low. Some kids still glared at them in the halls, but others surprisingly gave them a chance. Not because they forgot what happened, but because the new program taught them that people can change if they're willing to do the work. Dev joined a study group. Rico started eating lunch outside, alone at first, then with a kid from his chemistry class who didn't care about his past, only that he knew how to balance equations. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a start. Trey never came back. His family moved over the summer, Darius heard through a cousin that he'd enrolled in an alternative school, the kind with stricter rules and smaller classes. He didn't feel glad, didn't feel sorry, just hoped quietly that somewhere down the line, Trey would learn that respect isn't taken. It's earned. As the school year wound down, the changes kept growing. The student council organized a kindness week with no irony, just real effort. Notes of appreciation left in lockers, free hot chocolate on chilly mornings, a wall where anyone could post something good they'd seen someone do. It wasn't forced. It felt alive. One afternoon, Darius was walking to the library when a new student, a quiet girl with glasses too big for her face, hesitated near the entrance, looking lost. Without thinking, he stopped. "First day?" he asked gently. She nodded, clutching her schedule like a lifeline. "Cafeteria's that way," he said, pointing. "But if you want a quieter spot, the courtyard behind the science wing gets sun this time of day. And Ms. Lynn in room 214 always has extra granola bars if you're hungry." The girl blinked, then smiled. A small, real thing. "Thanks. No problem," he said, and kept walking. It was such a small moment. But it echoed. Because months ago, no one would have done that for him. Now he was the one making sure someone else didn't have to feel alone. At home, life settled into a new rhythm. His grandfather still made pancakes on Sundays, still asked about his day, but now their conversations weren't just about surviving school. They were about building something better. "You proud of yourself?" His grandfather asked one evening as they washed dishes side by side. Darius thought about it. "Not really proud, just glad I didn't stay quiet." "That's enough," his grandfather said, handing him a clean plate. More than enough. Graduation wasn't for another year, but already Darius was thinking ahead. He'd started looking at colleges with strong social justice programs. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he'd learned that change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when ordinary people choose to speak, to act, to care, even when it's hard. On the last day of school, the principal called him into her office. Not for trouble, just to talk. "You've made a real difference here," she said, sitting across from him with a cup of tea. "More than you know," Darius shrugged. "I just did what felt right." "Sometimes," she said softly, "that's the hardest thing to do." He left the office and walked through the nearly empty halls. Lockers stood open, floors freshly mopped, sunlight streaming through tall windows. For the first time, Jefferson High didn't feel like a place he had to endure. It felt like a place he'd helped shape. That night he sat on the porch again, notebook in his lap. Not writing complaints this time, just thoughts, hopes, ideas for next year's peer program. His grandfather joined him, handing him a glass of iced tea with a slice of lemon. "You know," the old man said, settling into his chair, "most people spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to fix things." Darius smiled. "Yeah, but someone's got to start." And as the fireflies blinked on in the dusk, he knew, quietly surely, that he already had.